Welcome back to the reading of To MILELE. We are on chapter 6. We did read 4 and 5 last time. Chapter 4 introduced the sovereign prince and sovereign emperor. Chapter 5 showed more of Hope's conflict with her idea of what she thinks Prince Adani should be doing for the world. We also were introduced to more of the grounds of the compound, the recreational areas, as well as the waterfall cascading down the mountain. We also learned that the mist in general keeps the earth warm, except for the mist patch, which is cool and dry. We learned about the key, which was given by the sovereigns to humanity to rule the world, which they traded for the vial, which was given by the Weltgeist. That's quite a mouthful. And that's because of that, there was a toxin created in the world, which Prince Adani's blood was used to make an antidote. But of course, the antidote was voluntarily received. It's not something that could be mandated like our vaccines that we've had recently, but and it was necessary for, another word we've learned, the essence of the sovereign, which allowed for people to have Eden 2 DNA. We also learned about the truth tome, which has a lot of things in it related to Prince Adani. You'll learn more about it as we go on. And we met Mendax Nubian, who, well, we didn't meet him, but we read about him. And he is a self-proclaimed prophet that has proclaimed that Keiko will be one most likely to rule the world. I think that pretty much sums up what I needed to say for those chapters. So let's head in to chapter 6. Now, we've been to Eden 2 and we've been to Jennies, the realm of the sovereigns. Now, the one place we've talked about, mentioned, we will go there, to Israel. After the high altitude through the never-ending gray mist, the military aircraft's gradual descent into Israel's airspace was a welcome relief. Even after flying with the world envoy for the last 3 years, Nathan still found the emergence into clear airspace with Israel's visible topography below a beautiful novelty. The sky was sunny and blue above the tiny country where the significantly increasing population worked busily to help keep their nation and the world afloat. Remember, only Israel and Eden 2 are able to produce large amounts of crop. Other crops in other places were in artificially lit greenhouses, which wasn't enough. Nathan observed his boss, who sat impassively looking out the window. His usual, which is Keiko's usual preparations prior to descent were noticeably absent. The man had been changing increasingly these past few months, going through a kind of metamorphosis that Nathan couldn't account for. Now he rarely divulged his thoughts to Nathan, whereas before their relationship had been different. Keiko, at that time caged by his celebrity status, had found a sounding board, a confidant, not just an employee in Nathan. Now it seemed more strictly employer and employee, except for where Hope was concerned. When Keiko talked about Hope, they seemed like friends again. When Nathan had first met him, Keiko Bays was an energetic, charismatic young man with vision and purpose. It had been the year before the mist, before he knew he would one day work as executive assistant to the wealthiest, most influential man in the world. It had seemed an accidental meeting at the time. Nathan had just been climbing the corporate ladder as PR manager for a renowned business tycoon, a close friend of his parents. It was through this employer that he had met Keiko. From the moment they met, Nathan had sensed an omen of destiny. But how could he have known that Keiko would also be one to greatly challenge the position of those loyal to Prince Adani? Now, within the last 5 years following the disaster, Keiko had swayed the majority of people to accept the Council of Nations propaganda of a world united under one leader, with the core belief that humanity was its own master and everything should be done to propagate and protect that legacy. Fringe groups across the world rebelled against the one world rule, and there was also a remnant faithful to the teaching of Prince Adani, who believed that humanity's true destiny was found in the sovereigns. And Israel, the country that had incubated and spread Prince Adani's work, was another fly in the ointment that Keiko had overcome with transference of the Council of Nations to its very grounds. The pilot's announcement broke Nathan's reminiscing. After clearing the complex security measures that had transfixed the entire country, the plane was coming near the end of its descent. The small nation had always had tight security, but now the net was unlike any ever imagined. New scene. 2 hours later, Nathan's sense of well-being at being back in Israel had diminished considerably. He grimaced internally each time Keiko Bays mentioned Hope's name at the Council of Nations meeting, over which Keiko was presiding. He disliked the fact that he had to sit in such an oppressive atmosphere. As impressive as it was in such a stately hall in one of the grandest hotels in Tel Aviv, and even in his immensely important role, Nathan no longer had an appetite for it all. "What I don't understand," the chairman of the council began after adjusting the long-stemmed microphone in front of him, "is how no differences in Hope Kanisa's DNA has been detected." His small stature belied the strength and deepness of his voice. His gaze briefly touched Nathan before returning to Keiko. "Even Mr. Kanisa, her twin, is unable to survive in the mist patch," the chairman continued. Including the chairman, there were 10 powerful nations represented. Other VIP assistants sat in rows of chairs semicircled behind the core group. Nathan sat at the forefront of the rows. "And what of this Agios person who rescued her?" another council member asked. "We continue to hear strange reports concerning him, of his ability to counsel, to heal, to sway the powers that be on Eden 2. How has this been allowed to continue?" The Secretary of Council intentionally cleared his throat. "Mr. Chairman, I believe we've already reached a consensus on this topic. He apparently has special access as not only as one indigenous to the island, but also as ambassador of Prince Adani." "It's utter nonsense," Keiko exclaimed suddenly and unexpectedly, startling everyone. "He's no more indigenous than you or I, and Adani has no real business in our affairs since he has removed himself." Keiko glared around the table. "Let me remind you all, it's only the memory of Adani that these people hold to. We know he is dead." Nathan had sensed a change in Keiko's mood at the mention of Agios, a change which increased with talk of Prince Adani. When Nathan had first entered the meeting, Keiko had lapped up to the attention and flattery of the council, all the while maintaining a charming demeanor. But now Keiko seemed restless and irritable. Even if the general consensus of his death was accepted, the fact that Keiko refused to use Prince Adani's title at such an official meeting effectively showed his contempt. Even outside of Eden 2, it was common knowledge that a small minority still believed that Prince Adani could possibly be alive, having never died at all. They believed his death was only a concoction to inspire the devotion that so often followed martyrdom. The room had remained silent after Keiko's uncharacteristic outburst. Now he seemed to rein himself in, speaking in a calmer tone. Yes, those loyal to him have chosen to support the island project, but at what expense? What profit is there for them? What more do they hope to gain to benefit their own purposes? Many heads were nodding, but a few seemed unconvinced. And yet, the chairman began, we cannot survive without their help. Around the table, silent nods showed unanimous agreement. Nonsense! We will survive without them. The tension radiating from Keiko was palpable. He stood up, straightened his tie and suit jacket. He held his hands palm up, beseeching. You have given me authority for a world that needs focus, direction, solutions. It isn't impossible. He looked steadily at the 10 leaders. It's not dependent on a man who may or may not live in the sky somewhere. Disgust laced his tone. Let me have complete power, and I will bring the world to order. He stared straight ahead. I will recreate the world. Nathan was alarmed at Keiko's last words. A mixture of delight and doubt was in the murmurs that now circled the room. But Nathan's attention was inexplicably drawn to Keiko's bodyguard, who was standing at attention near the entrance. It was just as well the populace of Eden 2 had never had full view of the towering figure of the man without his specially fitted pea suit. Tsabe was completely bald and devoid of any facial hair, with skin that could only be described as void of color. His large hands were clenched at his sides, legs stiffly apart. He wore a dark, loose-fitted jumpsuit like prison inmates, with his feet encased in military boots. His dark, soulless eyes were fixed upon all that was occurring in the room. New scene. Weary from the day's seemingly unending events, Nathan welcomed a night of solitude in his hotel room. 2 security personnel escorted him through the hotel to a section that had been specially cordoned off for the world envoy, the world leaders, and their parties. Earlier, the Council of Nations meeting had ended with much sobriety. Their next mission was to finalize the world envoy's mandate. Soon, the world would most likely have a world leader, chancellor of the world. It had never been done. Just before entering his room, Nathan noticed a curious hesitation by the female security on his right. The male security on his left entered the room to complete the usual brief checks. Nathan's hand was lightly bumped by the female security. Something smooth and flat brushed his skin as she slipped something into his hand. She made urgent eye contact, frowned, and subtly shook her head, relaying a message to be silent. She stepped away from him. Too surprised to know what else to do, Nathan waited quietly until the male security returned. The male security stepped out of the room and nodded to Nathan. Have a good night, Mr. Kanisa, he said, then waited for Nathan to enter the room. After entering, Nathan turned to look at them. They turned to leave. He shut the door. We're back to Eden 2. Ruth took the chart that Dr. Mark Dupont handed to her. The morning's pace had been slow and uneventful, and now she looked forward to a pleasant lunch break. Quite interesting, Dr. Mark began in a well-modulated voice with a thick French accent. He's as fit as any human being I've ever examined. He pushed his glasses up his high-bridged nose. Magnificently so, actually, considering he spent so many days possibly malnourished in a submarine. Without responding, Ruth leaned against Dr. Mark's desk and began quickly leafing through the chart in her hand. Michael Shetty. His results were indeed impressive. You're right, he has Eden-2 DNA. Ruth looked up. Dr. Mark's tall, thin form blocked her view of a large computer screen on the wall. His mind was probably already focused on other issues, typical of the man's all-consuming brilliance. Before the mist, as an older, never-married professional, his life had been consumed with medical research, treatments, and surgeries. He answered slowly, Yes, we've done a thorough assessment, except... Except? Ruth prodded. He continued staring at the screen for a while, testing her patience. Ah, his psychological assessment has just come through, just as I thought. He turned to look at Ruth briefly, his pale blue eyes bright with discovery. His thin lips twitched at the corners. Great mental abilities, a true warrior. Ruth resumed her perusal of the chart, knowing the cat-and-mouse game Dr. Mark liked to play. He would say no more and let her find her own answer. After reading for a bit, awareness flooded in. She looked across at him. He was smiling smugly. He's different, isn't he? Ruth said. Now, my dear, Dr. Mark began, turning to face her and scratching his thinning gray hair. Yes and no. Possibly an agent of the sovereign emperor. Dr. Mark turned back to the screen, once more consumed with work. His office in the medical center was quite spacious, part office, part exam, part conference room. Whatever the good doctor deemed it to be at the time. Once he had been found running his own lab experiment because he had been impatient with Eden-2's laboratory protocol. That incident had not gone over well with Dr. Janice Misra. Practically the whole island had heard of the lecture she had dished out, one that had continued for days. Months later, Dr. Mark still towed the line, earnestly regretting not his experiment, but the lecture from a woman half his size. Ruth smiled to herself. She was sure it was only a matter of time before Dr. Mark transgressed again. Interesting how these people had become like family. People she perhaps would not have rubbed shoulders with so intimately had the world not gone into a tailspin. And Hope. She most likely would not have met Hope nor Boa. Her heart swelled. Now, there was a man she would definitely have mourned not meeting. Being abandoned by her parents as a child and by the system when she reached adulthood had left Ruth very much alone. Had it not been for an elderly couple who had seen value in her and had not only taken her in, but had also shared Prince Adani's truths, her life would have continued spiraling down a destructive path. Dr. Mark moved away from the screen, and Ruth quickly read the contents there. Very interesting, she said, turning to Dr. Mark, who was now sitting on a stool with another chart in his hands. Do you think Agios will confirm it? Dr. Mark shrugged, smiling. One can never tell with Agios. That is to confirm whether Michael Shanti is an agent of Prince Adani. Some minutes later, hoping to get some fresh air and sunshine, Ruth ventured outside to the west side of the hub. Boa was at the picnic table where they had been in deep discussion with Hope a few days ago. He looked up, smiling, looking peaceful in the green park-like surroundings. Ruth had just started on her way to join him when she heard a call from behind. She turned around. Hope was standing there looking penitent. "Am I still welcomed?" "Don't be silly," Ruth said, smiling and shaking her head. She walked back and locked arms with Hope, then pulled her along to the picnic table. No sooner had they settled than youthful voices echoed in the vicinity. Hope reached over to tap Ruth. "There they are, the rascals. I hear they've been hiding from you. What did they do this time?" Ruth looked up at two teenage boys laughing not far from them. They were playfully shoving each other around. She immediately stood to her feet. Now remember I said children were not allowed on this island. But wait, you'll understand. Ruth immediately stood to her feet. "Cree, Lucas, here, now!" The boys froze, looking startled. They stared at Ruth, then, as if communicating telepathically, both started backing away. "Don't even think about it," Boa warned, also standing. At his powerful male voice, the boys froze again. They looked sheepishly at each other. With hands tucked in the front pockets of their khaki shorts, they slowly made their way over. "Have you nothing to say to Miss Ruth?" Boa's voice was more subdued. With pained expressions, the boys remained silent. Finally, the older boy, Cree, spoke. "We didn't mean anything by it, Miss Ruth." He looked at Ruth, then at Hope. We just don't like how the envoy is always bugging Miss Hope, so you thought that pulling a stunt on his bodyguard would be okay?" Ruth asked, trying to be patient. As their primary caregiver and assigned guardian, she needed to address the situation, even as her heart ached for the 15 and 13-year-old boys, the only youth on a working island set up for productive adults. The two were basically hidden orphans, unregistered on the island because they were underage. The boys remained silent, so Ruth directed her attention to the older boy. "Cree?" Cree looked at her with a sheepish kind of sadness, then over at Lucas. An unspoken message passed between them, reminding Ruth of their closeness. Cree, though indigenous to North America and Lucas to South America, had somehow been found together a year ago, hidden in barrels on a cargo ship, the only successful stowaways to Eden 2. They'd escaped from human traffickers and had begged to stay rather than be sent back to foster homes. They were only two of thousands of children kidnapped for their blood, which was thought to hold Eden 2 DNA. All children were thought to have Eden 2 DNA, and indeed, under a certain age, they did. "What did they do?" Hope asked, coming up beside Ruth. Ruth looked at Boa. Boa answered. "Keiko Bay's bodyguard sleeps sitting upright outside the entrance of the VIP suite. The boys sabotaged his air supply. Don't ask how. It caused a ruckus, but the boys had disappeared before he woke up. And since technically the boys aren't here on the island, no one could give a reasonable explanation." Hope giggled, then turned to cover it up with a hasty gasp. Cree's straight black hair fell over his eyes as he hung his head, while Lucas's dark brown curls flowed back in a riotous mess as he looked up at the sky. After begging us to keep you here, you're both working overtime to be sent away, aren't you? Ruth said. Both boys protested simultaneously. No, Miss Ruth, please. We won't do it again. We're sorry. New scene. Gideon eyed the man standing beside his commanding officer. Michael Jancy had appeared with Captain Nicholas Hunt, a tall, fiery-haired, middle-aged man who had a no-nonsense approach to work. This attitude continued even off duty, but the men trusted him, and his uncompromising demeanor was softened by his clear blue eyes and a boyish scatter of freckles across his rosy skin. Michael returned Gideon's stare. His gaze held something that told Gideon he was made of the right stuff. He had been commissioned to their group, 12 altogether, now counting Michael. They all had one thing in common. They were pilots. Colonel Davenport had allowed Michael's claim that he was a special operations pilot to be tested. He had already scored perfectly on the written assessment. Today, Gideon would accompany him in flight. After the morning drill, Captain Nick said, "Okay, men, we've lots to accomplish today. Let's move." Gideon hoped Michael's flight would go well. Captain Nick wasn't easy to please. Word had gotten around that years before the asteroid, his wife and unborn child had been killed in a tragic car accident. He had never remarried and had buried himself in military duties. He brought the same work ethics to Eden too. A third of the pilots quickly moved off for duty, while the others hung around to see Michael in action. The whole island, it seemed, had heard about him. Captain Nick looked at Gideon. "He's all yours, Mandela. Leave no stone unturned." "Yes, sir." Gideon waited until Captain Nick walked away before turning to Michael. "You, come with me." Michael smiled, almost looking amused. Gideon shut him down. "Wouldn't get too happy yet. At least, not until I can bring a positive report back to the captain." Gideon started walking. Michael followed. "And if you crash my plane and manage to survive, I'll come after you and finish the job myself." Michael still smiled. Gideon scratched his head. He couldn't figure him out. New scene. We're back to Israel. Nathan had been sitting feeling tense in his hotel room for the last half hour, not sure what was expected of him. Finally, he sprawled backward against firm sofa cushions. The tiny note was still in his hand. He needed to destroy it, of course. That was the note given to him by the female security. As he looked around the spacious sitting room, his mind wandered. They would contact him, he was sure. But what would they expect of him, this secret group of Prince Adani's loyals, known as the Underground Israeli Loyals? The group was composed of Jewish men who continued to grow in number, all from the 12 ancient tribes of the original Israelis. Already they'd put Nathan in a dilemma with their provocative revelations about a one-world government that would spurn the very position of Prince Adani. They seemed to have knowledge that the world would enter a time never experienced before. A world of deception and suffering controlled by one man, his boss, Keiko. He looked at the note again, a small rectangle of white with words inscribed in black ink. The words said, "The beginning of the end. We'll find you in 24 hours. Beware the alluring woman." Taking a deep breath, Nathan slowly rose from the sofa. The path from the living area through the bedroom to the luxurious bathroom seemed long. He understood the first part. The alluring woman? That he didn't understand. He tore the paper into tiny fragments, then released them to the clear water beneath. He flushed. He wished Prince Adani would make an appearance, or even Agios. And then he felt him. Agios was with him. Nathan felt peace. He felt empowered. That is the end of chapter 6. And I hope you join me next time for chapter 7. Take care.